Hey folks, this is Best in Slot and welcome to the fourth of 5 videos we'll be doing on Prehistoric Planet Season 2, covering the show as it airs throughout the week, focusing on dinosaur design discussion, reviewing the scenes, and talking about both the science on display and highlighting some of the fun camera trickery along the way. Today in episode 4 we'll be delving into the oceans. It's time to put all those compliments I've been making about the new water physics to a real test. We begin with a looming shadow as the sizable heft of a Mosasaurus slowly sidles into view. There's no mention of where we are, but we'll get to that in just a second. I'm assuming this though to be Mosasaurus hoffmanni, which is basically global in its distribution. It's got a transatlantic distribution found on both sides of the planet. There's nice touches here though as resident crustaceans recede into the darkness as the Mosa comes into the frame, positing it as this larger than life threat. That does not go quite as much for our second Mosasaur, Phosphorosaurus, who is absolutely adorable, aren't they all? Phosphorosaurus is a small Mosasaur, and its presence here puts us in either Japan or Belgium, which is where the two different species of that genus are found. Of course, it's a little harder to say because we're in the oceans and they can travel so freely. She's tentative, sleeking her way through reefs. This is the kind of shot this episode does really well. Glimpses of our new animals between real-world reefs. She spends her days hiding, as at less than 10 feet long, she's small potatoes compared to some other life in the area. However, she's a lizard, she still needs to dart to the surface and breathe. It's suggested this happens once or twice an hour, and that puts it roughly in line, perhaps a little less efficient considering how much you have to move, with the likes of modern sea turtles. There's more ominous shots of the larger Mosasaur lurking in the shadows, not shown again outright, always just a looming nearby presence, a constant threat. And so our Phosphorosaurus waits until night falls to begin her hunt, with this beautiful shot of moonlight rays splitting open the umbra of the ocean. She blends in moderately well with these scenes. I wouldn't say it's as knockout believable as some of the dinosaur scenes, but it's a tough job to do, I'm sure, with such complicated lighting, and I'd say overall throughout the episode, they've done a good job of integrating the CGI into the wider ocean. But now it's time for one of my favourite PP things, camera tricks. We're given this empty shot of the sea, with Attenborough mentioning how a huge, the largest on Earth, mass migration takes place at night in the oceans, but it can only be seen with a special camera. There's a stinger, a burst of sharp sound, and it flips to this image filled to the brim with glowing bioluminescent fish. It's unfortunately not the same location or anything, but it's still very effective. And I love whenever they treat the subject so seriously as to suggest they're whipping out the new camera equipment. These are lanternfish, and they're well known for what's called diel vertical migration or diurnal vertical migration, and that simply means a vertical migration upwards through the seas during nighttime, receding back into the depths during the day. This lets them feed in relative, I do mean relative, peace, and with the huge amount of biomass that takes part in this every day, it is indeed the largest synchronous migration on the entire planet. The ball of lights is confusing for predators, but not Phosphoro, who has, relative to her body size, the largest eyes of any Mosasaur. They also have actually overlapping fields of vision against one another, which means she has the capabilities of depth perception. I can't say the word depth today. Another useful tool for hunting. But, as it always must, believe me, I know, feeding time has to end, and as day rises, the Phosphoro slinks back into the reefs, and we end up with this beautiful shot that really emphasises the difference between these Mosasaurs, with the Phosphoro tiny in the foreground, dwarfed by the hulking shadow of the Mosasaurus in the backdrop. Next we're in North America, in warm, shallow seas where we see a gigantic bait ball form. This is a defensive measure that fish take when threatened, and the idea really is largely just to confuse predators and hide yourself within a crowd, lessening the chance that you're the one who gets eaten. It's not a particularly effective strategy, and some predators have actually learned to purposefully panic fish into creating bait balls so they can more easily feast. Others can take advantage of this as well though, such as Hesperornis, a cormorant-like bird discovered by Marsh during the fabled Bone Wars. We see it diving and twisting through the bait ball, honing in on individual fish to clamp within its teethed beak. I really love the design of this thing, the dark blues and whites perfectly suited for the aquatic environment, but broken up by that longer swathe of yellow that sweeps down past the beak. It also looks like it's wearing very elaborate eyeliner, which is a bonus. It's my chemical cormorant. A beautiful creature overall, and it moves through the water brilliantly well. For the Tarantino fans out there, we even get a close-up look at its feet, and you can see whilst the foundation of them seems pretty typical for an avian dinosaur, they're individually splayed out into these large paddles that it can use to push forward through the seas. Attenborough here mentions the needle-sharp teeth of the Hesperornis, and they're actually quite unique. Whilst like other most Mesozoic birds, it does have both teeth and a beak, Hesperornis was unique in that its teeth sat in a long groove as opposed to in individual sockets. Funnily enough, this also occurs in Mosasaurs, not that they're related, or are they, but it's a fun example of convergent evolution, the evolution of similar features in different species at different times, in different places, etc. I really do love this design though, and the music playfully amps up the slight oddity of the situation as it swims its way right into the face of the camera, showcasing the design work fully. It even tilts its head at the end, looking at the camera before it swims off. It's almost as though the camera has been sunk into the ocean and the Hesperornis is curious about it. Something we see in nature documentaries from time to time, and I love that grounded feel it gives us. Of course, such huge amounts of prey will also attract other predators. One of my most hyped creatures makes its appearance, Cephactinus, a voracious bony fish that could grow up to 20 feet long and was renowned for its ferocious appetite, being found over and over again with the remains of gigantic prey within its system. One was even found with another 6-foot long fish inside it, almost fully intact, and it's likely the Cephactinus died as the other fish wriggled within its stomach. It had been swallowed alive. That's dedication to getting your meals in. We get a lovely shot as they approach that apes classic shark films, something rarely seen on non-shark animals, and they feast. But soon the fish numbers dwindle, and the hungry Cephactinus must look elsewhere for its meal, hunting down the nearby Hesperornis, and with great success it must be said. Hesper might be quick and nimble in its own right, but Cephactinus is an absolute monster, and I love it deeply. It's exactly the ferocious hunter it should be, and gives the framing to make it so, encroaching from behind again in the style of so many shark films of the past. The chase sequences go on for a while with the music ramping joyfully up in tempo, a mix of playful and horrifying that really suits the tone, until finally one of the Hesperornises disappears into the gloom of the ocean, and we get this fantastic close-up shot of a disappointed looking Cephactinus. With that mouth though, they always look disappointed. The huge upturned curve of the mouth and the jagged implementation of the large conical teeth really do sell it as a nightmare of the seas, and it's quickly become one of my favourite designs in the series. And in case you weren't convinced by the nightmarish nature, we get a little bit of cannibalism to boot. A fish has got to eat, after all. This is something that's shown in the fossil record as well. I found a blog post from someone called Ashley at the RMDRC lab, which I believe is in Nigeria, that found a Cephactinus clathrum bone within the skeleton of another Cephactinus, and it was pitted from stomach acid. The clathrum is a bone that forms part of the gill chamber in fish, and it shows that for Cephactinus, basically everything was on the menu. For part 3, we're heading to Europe, where roaring seas and the pull of the tides are creating their own problems for some teeny tiny fellas. It's time for the Ammonite section, beginning with a swathe of tiny eggs being rolled around by the tides. I was a little apprehensive scripting this bit. This is not an area I'm knowledgeable on in the slightest, but we're going to learn a lot and we're going to see what we can dig up on the internet as we go through. And if not, we'll call them cute and be done with it. We get some lovely, almost abstract shots of them as they roll around the tides, framed by the misting of the water in the backdrop like some bizarre alien invasion, and I love that you can still see the tiny ammonites within each egg, nestled within this cloudy housing. There's a nice shot of what I assume is a real crab with the CGI laid over the top of it, very effective at selling the imagery overall when you combine the two like that. I did try to track it down, but without success, which is a little unsurprising given there's 4,500 species of the bloody things. The eggs are residing within rock pools, a safer location less buffeted by the tides, and just look at their little faces in there, I love them. They begin to hatch, and if we're honest, they look a little like a child has dropped their collection of Ammonite toys into the water. It's not to say it's not realistic, that's just how they look, and I think in particular it's the lack of patterning or colour or texture on the shells that gives them a slightly plasticky sort of aesthetic. I took a look at modern newborn Nautilus as a closer comparison I could find, and the patterning on them does a lot of the heavy lifting, I think, at making them look realistic. I mean, they are real, but you know what I mean. Up close, you can see there are detail on those perfect swirls. There's some very light ribbing, which, you know, we always want, and I really love this almost cow-like patterning across the face, of the Ammonite, and those humongous round eyes. I think this is almost impossible to sell as real, so it's not something I'm holding against PP, and the animations of their propulsion makes them endearing if nothing else. Unfortunate then that the rock pool is beginning to dry out, and if it does so entirely, they're all going to perish under the midday sun. Some animals can survive this process by suspending themselves in like a liquid cocoon, waiting out the return of the tides or the rains for the pools to flood again, but the Ammonites have no such luck. They'll have to make their own. And they do in one of my favourite and the weirdest sequences in the show. The tiny ammonites clump together, and by all pushing in the same direction, they form this large moving mass inching its way over the bare rock and back into the waiting ocean. There's a lovely crunchy sound as this happens, and I really don't think it's CGI. I think they've made, look, this is speculation, but I feel like they've made a huge number of baby ammonites and just pushed them over a tide pool. I'd love to have an answer on that to be sure, but it doesn't look like CGI to me. Either way, it's bizarre and very effective. Again, I couldn't find a modern world counterpart for this behaviour. It's a very difficult thing to Google for. I'm sure it exists somewhere. I'm sure this is based on an existing animal, but again, I'd love to have some information about that if any of you have any. Unfortunately, they can't all make it. Some left stranded to dry out on the bare rock. Fortunately, that means we get a surprise arrival, a baby Pyroraptor. Look at the little guy! It looks basically identical to the baby Kuru and the baby Velociraptor, understandably, but with its unique almost leopard print patterning, it stands out a little bit more. We don't see the adult, just some babies snapping up some meals, a lovely bonus inclusion that also confirms our location as likely the south of France or the north of Spain. Next, we venture out into the Pacific and the return of Tuarangisaurus from season 1, an Elasmosaurid found in New Zealand, a mid-sized Elasmosaur at 25 feet or so in length. Tuarangi spends its days chilling out in shallow lagoons, safer from larger predators. Like all though, it must eat, and that means venturing out into deeper waters nearby. Time for some spooks. A drum begins to sound in the deep, reminiscent of the drums heard during the Mine of Moria sequence in the hit film The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. There's a booming cry from somewhere off screen and a large shadow sweeps over the frame. There's something here. It's the Mosasaurus. At this point, the largest predator in the ocean, and of course returning from season 1, you can in some frames make out that crimson colouring that it had across the back. I know I go on about it, but the music and sound design here is awesome. Gurgling water, the constant drum beat, Lord of the Rings or Doctor Who style, ominous hums, and even at one point this foghorn sound ringing out. Everything about the situation screams danger. Nutrients from the ocean floor have heralded the arrival of lots of fish, so our Tuarangisaurus have come to feed. This nutrient density is actually incredibly important for all marine life, and one of the purported reasons that blue whales today are so gigantic is an upswelling about 5 million years ago that caused a huge amount of nutrients to flood into open water, thus fueling the krill that fuel the whales. We also see it when icebergs melt and stuff like that, and they flood new water into the oceans full of nutrients. I digress. I've got to say the CGI work here is phenomenal. The lighting is absolutely on point and the animals really do seem to entirely inhabit the space. Both the Tuarangisaurus and the ambushing Mosasaurus feel alive here. Maybe not for long, as the Mosasaurus springs its trap, using its tail to propel itself upwards to the feasting Elasmosaurs. Worth noting now that this is the segment The Uncovered talks about. It mentions how Mosasaur was likely capable of sudden speed similar to modern reptiles like crocodiles, and how the C shape you can see is something employed by many aquatic animals as it allows them to achieve incredible speed very quickly by pushing their tails off the water itself. Apparently the PP team went so far as to commission a study to find out just how fast a Mosasaurus hoffmanni could swim, giving a number of 30 miles an hour with insane acceleration, reaching that speed in potentially a single second. These things were incredible predators, maybe the greatest predators the oceans have ever seen. We get another shot, really does feel like this section got some extra love, really, from above where you can make out the shapes of the chase beneath the water's surface. Like most hunts, this time the Mosasaurus was unsuccessful, but there's always another chance. A lone younger Tuarangi goes off on its own, and you don't see the hunt happen here. You see the calm, unbroken surface of the water, until you don't. And the Mosasaurus bursts upwards with the Elasmosaur within its jaws, its body arcing back over as it crashes back into the sea. It is awesome. And the water effects are so good here. I find it hard to believe it's a simulation. I think it must be part simulation, part real footage spliced over everything. I have no idea, but it's phenomenal. This kind of motion, of course, is seen in modern animals as well. Orcas came to mind for me personally. Either way, my concerns about the water effects have well and truly been settled. They are leagues above what they were in season 1. We're back once again to Europe and the Ammonites for our penultimate segment. I'm in two minds about this. On one hand, I love that the show keeps going back to the same animals for a second go, because I think narratively that's a lot stronger. And as you can see with our Ammonites here, it's given them time to grow. They've been lucky enough to find home in the seagrass. My only problem really with this segment is the positioning. We've only had one very short segment since the baby Ammonites, and I think that the first Ammonite segment should have been pushed back before this surfactanus. That said, even the Mosasaurus was a returning creature having cameoed in the Phosphorus segment, and in general I do really like when PP does this. We see less species, but narratively it's a lot more consistent. It's time anyway for some bizarre Ammonites. I'll do my best. Our first new ones are these long skinny ones, which is a genus known as Baculites. You can see with the younger ones there's still a bit of a curl at the top of the shell that will straighten out over time. They're born quite curly and they straighten out as they grow up. We then get a close-up, and it's worth mentioning that whilst the babies looked a little unbelievable, the older Ammonites are very effective, particularly in this close-up shot where the incredible texture of the flesh becomes apparent, as well as this misshapen detailing of the pupil, something you'll see in, say, like octopus as well. We return to Baculites, older now with the shells straightened out more and up to 6 feet long. The animations here are wonderful, this otherworldly pulsing and flailing as it feeds from the sea floor. The similarly gigantic and utterly bizarre Diplomosaurus, PP actually names these, which is fantastic, swims by as well with its weird trombone or paperclip shaped body. Now when you see an ammonite like this with this very weird shape, these are what are called heteromorphic ammonites, whereas ones with that sort of more standard coil we call those homomorphic. There doesn't seem to be a consensus on the utility of such bizarre shapes. Some Ammonites did so to enable sea sponges to latch onto them more easily. Some seemingly evolved this way because it was beneficial for specific types of movement, such as moving vertically through the water. We get a glimpse of what I assume is a nautilus, given that quintessential red and white jagged banding, and generally the entire sequence feels like a classic modern nature documentary, where we discover a host of bizarre ocean species. These little guys don't have their full shape yet, but they're named as Nostoceros and will eventually grow into the most bizarre shapes. And we get to see that immediately afterwards, and I mean just, why? In PP, they're shown spinning slowly around as they descend through the water, and I suspect the show is implying what I just talked about in my little offshoot, that the shape is for vertical movement. I love, by the way, that they're bothering to name these Ammonites. I had 2 main criticisms from season 1. One was the water effects, and 2 was a lot of genera went unnamed. Season 2 has largely fixed that. In the end, the whole gang gets together for some group shots. The lighting is wonderful, and the entire thing just has this glow of weirdness and wonder. It's a brilliant segment, though I would have liked to see the Ammonites do a little bit more. It is mentioned at one point that the Ammonites could hunt fish, some of them, and I would have loved to see that because they don't really do anything but float. Our final segment, meaning we get 6 today instead of 5 because some of them are quite short, we're heading to the Antarctic. Mortonaria, an Elasmosaur, pops its head up through a pool in the melting ice. Attenborough mentions they're blubbery and warm-blooded, and the latter surprisingly rings true for a lot of these aquatic reptiles. Elasmosaurs were warm-blooded, and a 2016 paper from Harrell et al. Cites evidence that Mosasaurs were also potentially warm-blooded. Either way, another one of my favourite camera tricks comes back as the younger Mortonaria seems to spot the camera and inquisitively pokes its head towards it. This little action again just grounds the documentary, makes us feel like we're really there, the camera is really there, and I think that's a really important thing on a near enough fully CGI piece of programming. The Elasmosaurs look great, all striated muscle and bizarre tiny teeth and dark striped patterning. The calves have come here to the Antarctic for the very first time, and they need to learn how to breathe when most of the surface is covered in restrictive ice flows. But they also need to eat, and how they eat is fascinating. They're essentially filter feeders. They drag their mouths through the mud, partially closing their jaws, and filter out the tiny creatures living in the polar landscape. This is unique for Mortonaria amongst any marine reptile, and was thought to be impossible prior to a 2016 paper from Keith et al. That purported the methodology based on a wide range of things I'm not going to pretend to entirely understand. But basically they've got needle-like teeth that interlock without meeting up quite entirely at the tip, leaving space to filter out the muddy water and retaining the food particles. That, coupled with a really large oral cavity, made them effective filter feeders, just like some modern whales. And that's basically it for Oceans. A short episode crammed with scenes. It's like the shortest episode so far, but it's also the first one with 6 rather than 5 segments, which is a weird discrepancy. I enjoyed it largely. I have a couple of quibbles. The Tuarangisaurus sequence ended really well. That shot was incredible. But given that both the Tuarangisaurus and the Mosasaurus had been featured before, I wouldn't have minded a different Elasmosaur taking its place. It was nice to see the Mosasaur properly hunt this time, but a bit more variety wouldn't have gone amiss. The episode in general felt a little lacking in that regard, I would say, in terms of species, but I did love the attention given to the Ammonites, and seeing the surfactants come to life like that was great. I think the oceans always struggle a little for variety, as the scenery naturally ends up looking a little bit samey. But all told, whilst I don't think it was as good as the best ocean scenes of last season, it was still a really enjoyable episode, as it always is. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below, and join me tomorrow for the final episode and everyone's favourite biome. North America. Cheers, much love, as always. Bye-bye.
Houston, if you're ready, we'll maneuver. Reaching out.